What if the ghost of your deepest regret wasn't a ghost at all? What if it was a projection, a living dream created by an ancient alien consciousness? For Dr. Elara Vance, this nightmare became her reality. Trapped and hunted by a forest that can think, she must confront a perfect illusion of her dead brother, an apparition built from her own memories and grief. When the monster knows your heart, how do you fight back? Dr. Elara Vance commanded the lecture hall with the quiet authority of an established fact. Before her, a projection of a forest floor glowed, intricate webs of mycelium rendered in pulsing neon light, connecting the root systems of ancient trees. Her voice was as crisp and precise as the laser pointer she used to trace the symbiotic network. The relationship is not parasitic, nor is it merely beneficial, she explained, her words cutting through the academic silence. It is foundational. The fungus is the nervous system of the forest, a distributed intelligence communicating through chemical and electrical signals, sharing nutrients, water, and information. The forest, you see, is not a collection of individual trees. It is a single superorganism. A hand went up in the back row. A young, eager student. Dr. Vance, what about unexplained phenomena? People who get lost in forests talk about feeling watched or hearing voices. Could that be related to this consciousness? Elara offered a thin, patient smile. It was a smile that had debunked 1,000 theories. An interesting thought, but we must first exhaust the more probable and, frankly, more provable explanations. What you're describing falls squarely into the realm of psychology, not mycology. Ingested psychotropic spores, even in microscopic quantities, can induce auditory hallucinations. Combine that with the inherent disorientation of a dense woodland environment, and you have a perfect recipe for what we call confirmation bias. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. It will find a pattern, a voice in the wind, a face in the bark, whether one truly exists or not. Our job as scientists is to remain objective, to adhere to the evidence. A claim must be falsifiable. The feeling of being watched is not. It is an anecdote, not data. She clicked to her final slide, a stark black screen with a single white equation. Her world was one of data, of evidence, of clear, testable hypotheses. It was a world of elegant order, and in it, there was no room for ghosts in the machine. Her office was as sterile as a laboratory, a minimalist space of white surfaces and polished steel. Even the single orchid on her desk seemed to be adhering to some strict geometric principle. On her monitor, the face of a corporate funder was turning a shade of frustrated purple. But Dr. Vance, the preliminary reports on this Amazonian sample are extraordinary. The local tribes call it the spirit fungus. They claim it cures everything from malaria to melancholia. Elara adjusted her glasses, her expression unmoved. They also claim it allows them to speak with their ancestors. Mr. Jennings, your company funds legitimate botanical research, not ethnobiological fantasies. The sample you sent contained 3 previously identified species of cordyceps and a mild neurotoxin. It will not cure melancholia. At best, it will give you a headache. My assessment is final. It's baseless. She ended the call without waiting for a reply, the funder's face vanishing from the screen. A moment later, a new window opened. The face that appeared was grim, weathered, and set against the bland wood-paneled wall of a government office. Ranger Marcus Thorne. Dr. Vance, thank you for making the time. His voice was low, heavy with a reluctance that piqued Elara's professional curiosity. Ranger Thorne, your message was light on details. He nodded, running a hand over his tired face. It's a strange situation. We're hoping you can provide some environmental context. The location is a remote section of the Ochrewood National Forest. Elara's fingers were already flying across her keyboard, pulling up satellite images and geological surveys. 2 weeks ago, a group of 4 campers was found wandering on a service road, 20 miles from their registered campsite. They were suffering from dehydration, malnutrition, And well, the official term is shared delusion. They all told the same incoherent story, something about the trees whispering their secrets. Elara's expression didn't change. Psychotropic contamination is the most likely culprit. Water source, local flora, or a fungus they consumed. That was our first thought, Thorne conceded. But we can't find the source, and that's not the worst of it. A geological survey team from the university, your university in fact, was working in the same area. They've been out of contact for 3 weeks. Their equipment is still pinging, but they're not responding. He paused, his gaze dropping for a second. Locals have stories about that part of the Ochrewood, superstitions. They say people who spend too long in there get taken by the forest. Elara stopped typing. Ranger Thorne, with all due respect, I am a botanist. I deal in verifiable evidence. If you want a folklorist, I can recommend several. If you want to identify a potential biological or chemical agent responsible for this shared delusion, then I can help. Thorne looked up, a hint of desperation in his eyes. We need to rule it out, Doctor. Please, just come and take a look. The road ended abruptly, as if the asphalt had simply given up. Before her, the Ochrewood stood like a fortress wall. The trees were ancient, their bark thick and dark, their canopy so dense it seemed to swallow the afternoon light. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. There was no birdsong, no hum of insects, just a profound, unnatural quiet. Elara's state-of-the-art mobile lab, a gleaming silver machine of science and order, looked like an alien artifact parked at the edge of this primeval world. A man emerged from the shadows of the tree line. He was in his 50s, with a face as weathered as the bark of the trees he stood beside. This was Liam O'Connell, the mandated local guide Ranger Thorne had insisted upon. Dr. Vance, he said, his voice a low rumble that was somehow absorbed by the silence. He didn't offer to shake her hand. The ranger said you were coming. Mr. O'Connell, I'll be setting up a preliminary base here. Tomorrow, I'll need you to guide me to the researcher's last known position. Liam nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the impenetrable wall of green. We can do that, but a word of advice. Don't listen too hard in there. The woods, they play tricks. He looked from the forest to her. And be back here before nightfall. Nothing good stays in the Ochrewood after dark. Elara felt the familiar prickle of condescension, softened by professional politeness. It was the same tone she used on students who asked about haunted forests. Thank you for the advice, Mr. O'Connell, but my equipment will be doing the listening. It's far more sensitive and far less prone to tricks. Liam's expression didn't change. He simply gave a slight, knowing nod, as if her answer was the one he expected all along. As you say, Doctor, the abandoned campsite was a portrait of quiet chaos. It was nestled in a small clearing deep within the forest, a place the silence seemed to own. Liam had led her there with the practiced ease of a man walking through his own home. Tents were collapsed, not torn by claws but sagging under the weight of rain and neglect. A laptop lay open on a camp table, its screen dark. Scientific instruments, seismometers, atmospheric sensors, were overturned, their delicate wires spilling into the dirt. Elara moved through the scene with methodical detachment, her own tablet capturing every detail in high-resolution photos. She noted the lack of any blood, any torn fabric, any sign of a struggle. There were no large animal tracks. The food supplies were largely untouched. It was a scene devoid of violence, which made it all the more unsettling. It was as if in the middle of their work, 4 highly trained scientists had simply stood up, dropped everything, and walked away into the woods. They just vanished, Liam murmured, his gaze sweeping the trees. The forest took them. People don't just vanish, Mr. O'Connell, Elara countered, her voice sharp as she knelt by an open pelican case. There is always an explanation. Her focus was on the researchers' work. They were geologists, but they had soil and flora sample kits. She ran a gloved finger over a neatly labeled tray. Most were empty, their contents presumably logged and stored, but one small sealed container held something strange. Inside, Nestled in a bed of dark soil was a patch of mycelium. It wasn't the typical white, thread-like network. This was a pale, almost translucent growth that seemed to shimmer. As she angled the container in the dimming light, she saw it more clearly. A faint, soft, greenish-white light pulsed within it. A slow, rhythmic bioluminescence, like a dreaming heart. It was unlike any species she had ever seen or read about. For the first time all day, her clinical detachment gave way to a surge of pure, unadulterated scientific excitement. She had found it, the anomaly, the first piece of real measurable data in a sea of superstition and fear. Night fell, and the mobile lab became a sterile bubble of light against the oppressive darkness of the Ochrewood. Inside, the only sound was the hum of scientific equipment. Elara Vance was in her element. The strange mycelium sample sat under the lens of her digital microscope, and on the large monitor beside her, a universe came alive. It pulsed. A soft, rhythmic, greenish-white light emanated from the core of the network. A slow, steady beat, like a sleeping heart. It was beautiful, a phenomenon she'd never witnessed. But it wasn't the light that held her transfixed. It was the data streaming onto a secondary screen from the microsensors she'd placed in the sample's nutrient gel. Faint, patterned electrical signals, not random biological noise, but organized rhythmic pulses, complex, intentional. She leaned forward, her face illuminated by the glow of the screens, her earlier weariness replaced by the pure, addictive thrill of discovery. She began her audio log, her voice a hushed, excited whisper. Log entry, Day 1, Ochrewood sample analysis. The specimen, provisionally designated OM1, displays consistent low-level bioluminescence. More significantly, it is emitting coordinated electrical discharges across the entire visible network. The patterns are complex, far more complex than simple intercellular signaling. The pulses vary in frequency and amplitude, almost like a code. Initial hypothesis. This is a novel form of intercellular communication, potentially on a scale I've never before theorized. The bioluminescence may be a direct visual corollary to the signal's intensity. If this is happening in a petri dish, what is it doing across an entire ecosystem? She paused, staring at the pulsing light. For a moment, the missing researchers, the delusional campers, all faded into the background. She was a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough, and nothing else mattered. The next morning, Elara ventured deep into the forest's unnerving silence. Guided by a terrain scanner that cross-referenced with the sample's unique energy signature, she began deploying her sensor arrays. Each was a delicate spike of silver and wire, which she drove into the rich, dark soil at precise 50-meter intervals. The work was physically demanding, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the implications of her findings. The data streaming to her tablet was staggering. The network was everywhere. It wasn't just a patch here and there. It was a single, contiguous web of mycelium stretching for miles in every direction. A vast, subterranean blanket that connected the root system of nearly every tree in the grove. She was not walking through a forest. She was walking across the back of a single, massive organism. The scale was almost incomprehensible. As the afternoon wore on, a subtle dissonance crept into her concentration. It started as a faint feeling, a prickle on her neck. Then, she began to hear it. Faint, whisper-like patterns in the wind as it moved through the ancient canopy. It wasn't a voice, not a real one, but it was close enough to make her stop and tilt her head, listening. She'd scan the silent trees, see nothing, and shake her head, annoyed with herself. Auditory pareidolia, she thought, forcing the clinical term into her mind. A classic symptom of fatigue and heightened stress. Liam's superstitious nonsense is acting as a placebo. She consciously doubled down on her work, focusing on the hard data, the clean lines of the sensor grid on her map. Her mind was the finest instrument she possessed, and she refused to let it be compromised by suggestion or exhaustion. But even as she dismissed the sounds, a part of her couldn't help but listen for them again in the oppressive silence between the rustling of leaves. A storm was rolling in. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and the wind was no longer whispering. It was howling. Inside the van, rain lashed against the windows. Elara ignored it, her attention locked on the main monitor. The data from the newly placed sensor arrays was pouring in, coalescing into a single, terrifyingly beautiful image. The entire fungal network, spread across miles of forest, was firing its electrical signals in unison. The patterns were no longer simple pulses. They were waves, complex and cascading, flowing from one end of the grove to the other. She ran the patterns through a comparative analysis program, her heart beginning to beat faster. The software cycled through animal brainwaves, cetacean language patterns, avian flocking algorithms. No match. Then, on a hunch, she pulled up a human neurology database. She selected the file for deep, dream-filled REM sleep. The screen split. On the left, the complex organic wave patterns from the forest floor. On the right, the recorded brain activity of a dreaming human. They were nearly identical. "My God," she breathed, her hand going to her mouth. It wasn't communicating. It wasn't just organized. It was dreaming. At that exact moment, a bolt of lightning struck nearby, the crack of thunder shaking the very air. The lights in the van flickered violently. Her equipment surged, screens going black for a second before rebooting with a high-pitched whine. And in that split second of electrical chaos, the van's main speakers, which had been silent, exploded with sound. It was the whispers, the faint, imagined sounds from the forest, now amplified into a cacophony. 1,000 overlapping voices, speaking in a language of rustling leaves and snapping twigs and something else. Something utterly alien. It was a chorus of pure, raw consciousness, and it flooded the small space with its terrifying presence for one horrible second before a fuse blew and it was cut off, replaced by a sharp crackle of static and the drumming of the rain. Elara was pressed back into her chair, her breath catching in her throat. Her scientific certainty shattered into a million pieces. Sleep did not come easy. She lay in the narrow bunk in the back of the van, the storm outside a pale echo of the storm inside her mind. The brainwaves, the voices. She had listened to the recording from the surge a dozen times. It was real. Her equipment had heard it too. Every rational explanation was slipping through her fingers. Finally, hours past midnight, having been in the forest's suffocating proximity for well over 24 hours, an exhausted, dreamless sleep finally took her, and she was standing motionless, but it was not her body. She had no body. She was vast, ancient, unmoving. Her feet were roots, plunged deep into cool, dark earth, drawing strength and memory from the soil. Her skin was bark, thick and grooved, and she could feel the cold rain trickling down her trunk, each drop a distinct sensation. Her arms were branches, reaching up into the stormy sky, her leaves trembling in the wind. She was not alone. Her awareness stretched for miles, a web of silent, watching entities just like herself. She could feel the placid consciousness of the fir to her left, the ancient, slow thoughts of the oak to her right. They were all one, a collective mind dreaming a single shared, eons-long dream of sun and shadow, of growth and decay. And then she felt something else, a presence, small, warm, and utterly alien, an intruder, a single, frantic, agitated point of light in the vast, calm darkness of their shared mind. It was loud, its thoughts sharp and fast and chaotic, a spark of anxiety in an ocean of tranquility. She focused her immense, slow consciousness on it, 1,000 silent watchers turning their attention to this strange, new, noisy thing in their dream. It was her. Elara woke with a violent gasp, sitting bolt upright in her bunk. The van was dark and silent, the storm having passed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her skin was slick with a cold sweat, but it was the feeling in her legs that made her cry out. a phantom sensation, a tingling, vegetative numbness, as if she were still feeling the ghost of roots reaching deep into the cold, silent earth. The forest wasn't just in her equipment anymore, it was in her head. Daylight did little to dispel the lingering horror of the dream. Elara forced herself out of the van and back into the forest, driven by a desperate need to impose the comforting rituals of the scientific method onto a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly subjective. She looked pale, with dark circles under her eyes, her movements jerky and uncertain. She was trying to replicate her work from the previous day, collecting soil samples, checking sensor connections, but her concentration was a fragile, brittle thing. Every snap of a twig made her flinch. The forest watched her. She knew it was impossible, a paranoid delusion brought on by lack of sleep, but the feeling was unshakable. She saw things. Fleeting movements in her peripheral vision, dark shapes that darted between the ancient trunks, vanishing the moment she turned her head. She would freeze, her heart pounding, and scan the silent trees. Nothing. There was never anything there. Stress-induced visual artifacts, she muttered to herself, her own voice sounding thin and unconvincing in the oppressive quiet. Perfectly normal under these conditions, she knelt to collect a soil sample near the base of a massive gnarled oak. Her hands trembled slightly. As her fingers closed around the cold metal of the sampler, it slipped, clattering against a root. The sound was jarringly loud. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the world around her seemed to liquefy. The trees in her vision warped and twisted, their branches elongating into grasping skeletal fingers, the texture of the bark shifting into what looked like screaming faces. The very air seemed to vibrate. She squeezed her eyes shut and clutched her head, a wave of vertigo washing over her. "Psychotropic agent," she gasped, her knuckles white. "It has to be. Airborne, fungal, a powerful hallucinogen affecting the optic nerve." She clung to the clinical diagnosis like a life raft. It was a neurological symptom, a problem to be analyzed, a toxin to be isolated. It was not a monster. It was not real. She opened her eyes. The forest was still again, impassive and ancient. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. She fled back to the van, slamming the heavy door shut, the sound echoing her frantic heartbeat. The forest was no longer a place of research. It was a variable she couldn't control. Her own senses were compromised, her mind an unreliable instrument. She needed objective truth, something she could see on a screen, something measured in microns and millivolts. She needed the safety of her lab. Desperate for a rational, chemical explanation for her fraying sanity, she decided to bypass the network's energy signals and go deeper. She prepared a sliver of the Mycelium sample, OM1, for the electron microscope, a deep scan that would reveal its most fundamental cellular structure. She was hunting for the toxin, the specific molecule responsible for her waking nightmares. The van filled with the low hum of the powerful scanner as it began its work, bombarding the tiny sample with a focused beam of electrons. Slowly, an image began to render on her main monitor, building line by line. It was a grayscale world, magnified 100,000 times. She saw the familiar shapes of fungal cell walls, vacuoles, mitochondria. It was all textbook. She increased the magnification, pushing deeper, searching for the anomalous protein, the psychoactive compound. And then she saw it. She froze. Her breath caught in her chest. It wasn't a toxin. It was a connection. Between two adjacent fungal cells, the walls were thinner, and on either side, a dense collection of vesicles had formed, clustered against the cellular membrane. Bridging the infinitesimal gap between them was a haze of proteins, neurotransmitters. It was a synapse, a perfect biological synapse, identical in form and function to the ones in her own brain. Frantically, she panned the image, her hands flying across the controls. It was everywhere. Every cell was connected to its neighbors by these intricate synaptic gaps. It wasn't just a communication network. It was a biological neural network. Her carefully constructed hypothesis that the fungus was a simple organism using a novel signaling method shattered into dust. Her entire understanding tilted on its axis. The whispers, the brainwaves, the shared dream. It all crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. The forest wasn't like a brain, it was a brain. A thinking, feeling, dreaming entity of incomprehensible scale and age. The discovery, the single greatest scientific breakthrough of her entire career, was also the absolute confirmation of a reality more terrifying than any superstition she had ever dismissed. The monster was real, and she had just proven it. A wave of pure, primal terror washed over her. The clinical detachment, the scientific curiosity, it was all gone, burned away by the horrifying truth on her screen. She had to get out. Not later, not after more analysis. Now. She scrambled out of her chair, stumbling towards the door of the van. The quiet hum of the lab now sounded like a funeral dirge. She burst out into the late afternoon light, gasping for air that didn't feel saturated with an alien consciousness. She didn't grab her keys, her tablet, nothing. She just ran. Her feet pounded on the narrow forest path leading back towards the road, back towards sanity. But with every step, the world around her began to unravel. The whispers were back, no longer faint, but a roaring torrent in her ears, 1,000 voices speaking at once. The fleeting shadows in her periphery were no longer fleeting. They were solid, humanoid shapes that flitted between the trees, always keeping pace. Then she heard a new sound, woven through the cacophony. A single, familiar voice. It was Liam. Taken by the forest, it whispered. But the voice was wrong. It was distorted, stretched, echoing as if from a great distance. If you listen too hard, you'll hear the grey man coming. It was her memory of their conversation, twisted into a weapon and fired back at her. The forest was in her head, rummaging through her memories, learning her fears. Panic seized her. She ran faster, branches whipping at her face. The path ahead seemed to stretch and distort. Up ahead, where the shadows lay thickest, a figure stepped out from behind a tree. It was tall, impossibly slender, its limbs too long, its form seeming to shift and flicker at the edges. It wasn't made of flesh, but of moving patterns of shadow and light. Its texture like rotted bark and pale, creeping fungus. It had no face, only a smooth, blank surface that seemed to absorb the very light around it. It was the Grey Man, the silly local legend, the superstition she had scoffed at, and it was real. It turned its featureless face towards her. It was not a hallucination. It was a projection, a thought, an idea, a folktale pulled from her own mind and given form by the dreaming god she was standing on. Elara Vance, the pragmatist, the scientist, the woman who believed only in data, opened her mouth and screamed. The scream tore from Elara's throat and was swallowed by the indifferent silence of the forest. She didn't wait to see if the Grey Man would follow. She scrambled backward, stumbling through the undergrowth, adrenaline turning the world into a tunnel of blurred greens and browns. She reached the van, threw herself inside and slammed the heavy door, ramming the lock shut. For a long moment, she could only stay there, her back pressed against the cold metal, chest heaving as she dragged ragged breaths into her lungs. Outside there was nothing. The path was empty. The Grey Man was gone. But it didn't matter. The forest was still there, a constant, oppressive mental presence that hummed just at the edge of her hearing. It was in the static between her thoughts, a silent watcher behind her eyes. Night fell. She didn't dare turn on the main lights, working instead by the cold blue glow of her monitors. Sleep was an impossibility. Survival was the only imperative. She was no longer a scientist conducting research. She was a castaway on a hostile shore, and her lab was her life raft. She frantically reviewed the data, not for discovery, but for defense. She pulled up the brainwave recordings, the cascade of REM-like signals, and cross-referenced them with the campsite photos of the missing researchers. A new horrifying thought began to crystallize, cold and sharp. She looked at the photos of their faces, smiling, professional, alive. Then she looked at the data, the dreaming, absorbing, overwhelming consciousness. They hadn't been eaten by a predator. They hadn't gotten lost. The forest hadn't killed them. It had kept them. The shared delusion of the campers, the whispers of the trees. It was the chorus of the damned. The researchers' minds, their consciousnesses, had been absorbed into the network. They were the new voices in the choir. The stakes crashed down on her with suffocating weight. This wasn't about life or death. It was about escaping utter psychological annihilation. Her equipment was no longer a tool for understanding the world. It was her only shield, a way to track the network's electrical tides, to anticipate its terrible dreams before they could find their way into her mind. Her lab had become a Faraday cage for the soul. Dawn brought with it a fragile, desperate hope. Escape. She scrambled into the driver's seat, the key trembling in her hand. She ignored the way the trees outside seemed to lean in, listening. She turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. A dead, metallic click. She tried again and again. The engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. She slammed her fist on the steering wheel. A cry of pure frustration choked in her throat. She checked the console. Every electronic system was dark, unresponsive. The lightning strike hadn't just caused a surge, it had fried the van's entire electrical harness. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. As if sensing her despair, her laptop, which had been dormant on the passenger seat and running on its own internal battery, flickered to life. The screen glowed, but not with her data charts or logs. An image appeared. It was a photo of her and her parents at a national park years ago. Then another. Then her graduation. Another. Her first major research grant. Her personal photo library was cycling on the screen, an unsolicited slideshow of her life. The forest was digging, it was searching. The screen stopped on a single image. It was a candid shot, taken on a rocky mountain trail under a brilliant blue sky. She was younger, laughing. Standing beside her, with his arms slung around her shoulder, was her brother, Ben. He was 17, all teeth and unruly hair, alive with a youthful energy that seemed to radiate from the picture. The day before the fall, the last picture ever taken of him, her breath hitched. The grief, a beast she had kept caged for over a decade, rose up, raw and powerful. The forest had found it. It had found her deepest trauma, the core wound around which she had built the careful, rational fortress of her life. The attack was no longer random. The entity was intelligent. It was learning. It had found the perfect weapon to use against her, her own past. Night returned, and with it, the full weight of the forest's terrible intelligence. Elara sat in the darkened van, wrapped in a blanket, shivering more from dread than cold. She had taped over her laptop's camera, a futile, irrational gesture of privacy. The whispers were constant now, a maddening, intimate chorus that knew her name. Then they stopped. The oppressive mental hum vanished, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. She looked out the side window into the ancient grove, and her heart stopped. Standing in a small clearing, bathed in an ethereal moonlight that didn't seem to come from the sky, was Ben. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a picture. It was him. Perfectly rendered, three-dimensional, wearing the same faded t-shirt and climbing pants from that last photograph. He looked exactly as he did the day he died. Not a ghost of grief, but a living, breathing boy. He turned his head and looked directly at her, at the van. A slow, sad smile touched his lips. "Elara," his voice whispered, not through the air, but directly inside her head. It was his voice, his exact voice. "Elara, I was so lonely. It's so quiet here. Please, come out." Tears began to stream down her face, hot and silent. Every rational part of her mind screamed, trap, illusion, projection. But her heart, the foolish, grieving muscle in her chest, yearned for it to be real. It's okay, the projection of her brother continued, taking a step closer. His form was perfect, right down to the small scar above his eyebrow. They're all here. The others. We're not alone anymore. You don't have to be alone anymore. Just open the door, join us. The emotional pull was a physical force, an undertow threatening to drag her under. All her scientific resolve, her years of disciplined skepticism, it was a paper shield against this. This was a ghost woven from her own love and pain. Her hand, acting of its own accord, reached for the door lock. The urge to go to him, to apologize, to have one more moment was overwhelming. She knew it was a lie, a deadly, comforting illusion designed to lure her out, to assimilate her, to add her voice to the choir. But oh, how she wanted to believe it. Tears streamed down Elara's face, blurring the perfect, heartbreaking image of her brother. The boy made of memory, and light took another step, his hand outstretched, his voice a balm of perfect sympathy inside her head. Just open the door, Elara. It doesn't have to hurt anymore. Her hand trembled on the lock, every grieving cell in her body screaming to let him in, to accept the solace. But beneath the grief, a harder, colder instinct flared. The scientist, the pragmatist, who had built a life on the bedrock of verifiable truth. This comfort was a lie. This boy was a weapon. A sob, ragged and fierce, tore from her throat. It was the sound of a choice being made. No, she whispered, pulling her hand back from the door as if it were burned. You're not him. Outside, the illusion flickered. The sad smile on Ben's face faltered, a glitch in the projection. For a moment, it wore an expression of calm, alien confusion. Then, it dissolved, melting away into the moonlight, leaving only the silent, watching trees. The temptation was gone. The grief remained, but now it was fuel. Sobbing, she turned back to her equipment, her movements no longer hesitant, but filled with a desperate, furious focus. She worked through the night, ignoring the whispers that clawed at the edges of her mind. She triangulated the energy signals from her sensor arrays, the data points painting a clear picture on her screen. The network wasn't a flat, even web. It flowed and pooled, all its energy originating from a single, massively powerful epicenter at the very heart of the grove. A tree, one ancient, colossal tree that served as the network's central hub. She knew she couldn't escape on foot. The network's influence extended for miles. Her only chance was to go to the source. Not to destroy it, but to disconnect herself from it. She pulled out a directional sonic emitter, a device designed for geological surveys. Ripping out its core programming, she began to modify it, her fingers flying across the keypad. She wasn't building a weapon. She was forging a key tuned to the specific frequency of her own neural patterns, programmed to emit a chaotic, disruptive pulse. A signal that wouldn't kill the listener, but would simply make her own thoughts, her own consciousness, invisible to it. It was a desperate gambit, a scientific prayer aimed at a god she had only just discovered. Device in hand, Elara took a deep, shuddering breath and opened the van door. She stepped out into the living nightmare. The journey to the central tree was a descent into madness. The forest, now fully aware of her intent, threw everything it had at her. Terrifying apparitions lunged from the shadows. The grey man, twisted amalgamations of the missing researchers, their faces contorted in silent screams. The path itself became a weapon. The ground beneath her feet seemed to writhe like living flesh, and the trees warped and bent, their branches forming a thorny, grasping cage around her. The air was filled with the pleading voices of the assimilated, a psychic storm of terror and confusion. They begged her for help. They begged her to join them. They whispered her darkest insecurities into her ear. Her senses were liars. Her eyes, her ears, her sense of balance, none of it could be trusted. Her only guide, her only anchor to reality, was the small screen on the sonic device she clutched to her chest. On it, a single glowing dot marked the location of the central tree, and a simple, unwavering arrow showed her the way. She kept her eyes locked on it, a sailor trusting her compass in a hurricane. She ignored the phantoms. She stumbled over the writhing earth. She pushed through the phantom thorns. This was the ultimate test of her pragmatism. She had to completely abandon her own perception, her own subjective reality, and place her faith entirely in the objective, empirical data of her own creation. It was the only way. She broke through a final thick wall of grasping branches and stumbled into a clearing. There it stood, the central tree. It was impossibly ancient. Broader than her van was long, its bark a gnarled map of millennia. It reached for the sky like a cathedral, and the very air around it was thick and heavy, vibrating with an immense, silent, psychic pressure. And standing before it, blocking her path, was Ben. The projection was perfect, bathed in the same ethereal light as before. He wasn't pleading this time. He was just watching her, his expression one of profound, sorrowful disappointment. "You're hurting us," his voice echoed in her mind, calm and resonant. "Why would you do that? Stop, stay, be with me." Tears streamed down Elara's face, but her resolve did not waver. She raised the sonic emitter, its targeting light painting a small red dot on the massive base of the tree. She looked at the perfect image of the brother she had lost. "You're not real," she choked out. The words a final, painful acceptance. She thumbed the activation switch. A pulse, utterly silent to the human ear, fired from the device. The illusion of her brother vanished, not by dissolving, but by shattering like glass, the pieces winking out of existence. And then, the pressure in her mind, the constant hum, the chorus of whispers she had been living with for days, it was gone. Cut off. A switch had been flipped, a connection severed. She was met with a silence so profound, so complete, it was a physical shock. For the first time in days, she was completely and utterly alone in her own head. An exhausted, trembling figure emerged from the Ochrewood as the first rays of dawn painted the sky. Elara moved like a ghost, her face pale and tear-stained, but her eyes were clear. Liam was waiting for her at the tree line, a thermos of coffee in his hand. He had waited all night. He looked at her, at the deep, harrowing understanding in her gaze, and knew she had seen the truth of the place. He simply held out the thermos. There were no "I told you so's." There was no need. He simply nodded, a quiet gesture of respect between the man who had always believed and the woman who had been forced to. Later, in front of a tired and skeptical Ranger Thorn, Elara filed her official report. Her voice was steady, clinical. She spoke of a rare, previously undiscovered neurotoxic fungus, a species of psilocybe that released its spores in a cyclical pattern, inducing powerful, shared hallucinations in any mammal that remained in close proximity for an extended period. She explained the abandoned camp, the wandering hikers, all as predictable results of acute psychosis. It was a perfect, scientifically plausible explanation. It was a complete and total lie. She said nothing of the dreaming brain, of the assimilated minds, of the planetary consciousness she had touched. She used the language of science to create a cover story, to protect a truth so profound and terrifying that science itself was not yet ready to comprehend it. Her discovery would remain her own, a classified secret buried in her mind. She had arrived as a scientist, a cataloguer of the known world. She left as a guardian, a silent protector of the unknown. What's fascinating about a story like this is how it doesn't just pit science against superstition. It fuses them into something far more unsettling. Dr. Vance begins with the classic scientific assumption that once you explain something, you take away its power. A haunted forest is just psychotropic spores. A ghost is just confirmation bias. But the story poses a chilling question. What happens when the scientific explanation is actually more terrifying than the ghost story itself? It's one thing to see a random spirit. It's another thing entirely to be confronted by a perfect projection of your deepest loss, knowing it's being generated by a planetary intelligence that is actively reading your grief. The ghost of her brother isn't supernatural. It's a targeted biological weapon. In a way, that's a much deeper and more personal kind of horror. And her final act is the most telling. After surviving it all, she chooses to lie. She doesn't debunk the mystery with the truth. She hides that terrifying truth behind a simpler, safer explanation. She becomes a guardian of the mystery because the scientific reality is too immense to face. It makes you wonder, if you had undeniable proof of something so profound and terrifying, would you share that truth with the world? Or would you protect it?